Alrighty, sorry about the delay. Let's get cracking. So, no helicopter story this week. I wussed out at the last minute. Um, Mostly because it's not super long, and I'd have like an hour to kill, and figure out what I was going to add onto it. And what I'd kind of like to do is have a discussion with some people on it. Why, kind of asking, okay, what about this would make people upset? Why, and a few other things, but we're not doing that this week. Um, so instead, we are continuing our read through of this uh, PDFified, PDF'd issue of Astounding Science Fiction from June 1945, and we're doing it continuing with A.E. Van Vogt with Heir Apparent. Um, and possibly the story after it, because I don't think this one is super long. Um, I've read some A.E. Van Vogt on stream before. I'm kind of 50-50 on him. I think most of his stuff, on balance, he was a pretty good author. I don't know. I assume he's dead by now, but I don't know when he died, if he is dead, or what any of his more recent work looks like. I only really know him because of some short story collections that I have that feature him and uh, or contain stories all by him, as well as reading issues of things like Astounding Science Fiction and a few others where he is was a frequent contributor. Um, so again, this is from 1945, so it is dated in many ways by modern perspectives. This is your official warning, as with last week, that if there is some verbiage or behavior displayed by characters, it is not necessarily approved of by the person reading it, yada, yada, yada. Um, and you should just remember that it's a science fiction story from 1945, for goodness sake. Oh, well, you're reading it, so you must believe everything in it. Yeah, or it's a science fiction story, and I know that it's fictitious. And what it does isn't that, never mind. That I have to even imply that that conversation or question needs to be asked, I think is sort of sad, but we'll do it. Short me going and doing an entire stream where I explain in great detail all my personal views about things, which is another part of the reason why I didn't do the helicopter story this week, because it gets because people got very riled up, and I was like, it occurs to me that people could do the same thing to me that they did to the author of this story. And frankly, I mean, I'm not on much social media. Like, I do have a Facebook page, but I don't really check it very often. You can leave me messages and stuff. You can go ahead. I can't promise I'll get to you anytime soon, but it's there. It's an option. Um, in fact, I've updated the stream description accordingly, so it's actually directing you to the right place. Isn't that nice? Um, but yeah, so we're gonna read some short stories today. That got awkward quick. All right, give me one sec here. Heir Apparent by A.E. Van Vogt. Handing over a planet-wide empire to a successor is not a thing to be undertaken in a day or two, normally. But the old ruler had 4-day poison in his veins, and his heir might be the poisoner. And a revolution on his hands. And problems. Illustrated by Williams. It was an uneasy, all-pervading sensation, a threat of pain to come combined with the beginning of the pain itself. The old man saw that Dr. Parker was looking at him, startled. "Good heavens, sir," the physician said. "You've been given blackmail poison. This is incredible." Arthur Clegg sat very still in the bed. His eyes narrowed. his thought a slow pattern of reception to impression. His gaze took in the chunky, red-faced Parker, the enormous bedroom, the shaded windows. At last, grimly, he shook his shaggy old head and said, "When will the crisis come in a man of my age?" "About 4 days. The development is progressive, and the pain— whoops, wrong button. And the pain increases hour after hour by infinitesimal increments to a pitch of completely—" The doctor broke off in a thin-lipped fury. "This is the worst crime in the history of the world, poisoning a man 94 years of age. Why, it's—" He must have noticed the scornful quality of Arthur Clagg's gaze. He stopped. He looked abashed. He said, "I beg your pardon, sir." Arthur Clegg said coldly, "I once defined you, Doctor, as a person with an adult mind and the emotional capacity of a child. It still seems to fit." He paused. He sat in the bed, cold-faced, thoughtful. He said finally, in a precise, almost stately voice, "You will refrain from informing anyone of what has happened, not even my great-granddaughter and her husband. No one. And—" a bleak smile touched his gray lips, "do not be too outraged by the crime. A man who dares to hold the reins of government is subject to all the risks of the trade, regardless of his age. In fact—" He paused again. His smile twisted ironically as he went on. "In fact, as is already apparent, the struggle for succession to the power of an old dictator is bound to be ferocious. A year ago, a battery of doctors, including yourself, said I had at least 15 more years of life ahead of me. That was very welcome news, because I had, and have still, to decide who shall be my successor." He smiled again, but there was a harshness in his voice as he went on. "I now find that I have 4 days in which to make my decision. That is, I think I have 4 days. Is there anything in the news that will cut me down to even less time than that?" The doctor was silent for a moment, as if he was organizing his mind. Then, "Your armies are still retreating, sir. Machine guns and rifles out of museums are almost useless against the forbidden atomic weapons of the rebel General Garson. At their present rate of advance, the rebels should be here in 6 days. During the night they captured—" Arthur Clegg scarcely heard. His mind was concentrating on the words 6 days. That was it, of course. His great-granddaughter, Nadia, murdered Grayson, her husband. The whole power group in the Citadel wanted to force his hand before the arrival of the rebels. He grew aware of the doctor's voice. "Mr. Medrow thinks that the fewness of their numbers prevents them from making a breakthrough. They—" "Medrow?" echoed Arthur Clegg blankly. "Who's Medrow? Ah, I remember. That's the inventor whose writings you once tried to bring to my attention. But as you know, science no longer interests me." Dr. Parker clicked his tongue apologetically. "I beg your pardon, sir. I used his name quite inadvertently." The old man made a vague doesn't-matter movement. He said, "Send in my valet as you go out." The doctor turned at the doorway, and a grim look crept over his thick face. "Sir," he said, "I hope I will not seem presumptuous when I say that your friends and well-wishers will wait anxiously for you to turn the weapon on all your enemies." He went out. Arthur Clegg sat there, icily satiric. 50 years, he thought. For 50 years the world has been educated against war, against the use of weapons. For 50 years he had poured the wealth of the earth into the purest constructive channels, into social security, public works that were public, and not mere political catchpoles. The continents had been transformed. Every conceivable idea for improvement within the bounds of scientific possibility had been subjected to the marvelous pressures of money and labor. Green and fruitful in summer, gorgeously scientized in winter, peaceful and prosperous the year round, Earth turned its made-over face towards its sun, a smiling, happy face. There was not an honest man alive who ought not to glory in the miracle that had been wrought during the brief span of half a century. He had taken over a world devastated by atomic energy misused, and had changed it almost overnight into a dream of a billion wonders. And now Arthur Clegg suddenly felt his age. It seemed incredible that the first crisis could evoke the oldest evil impulse in human nature. Kill. Destroy all your enemies. Be merciless. Bring out the irresistible weapon. The surge of bitter thought quietened as a discreet knock came at the door. Arthur Clegg sat heavy with his problem as his valet entered. At last his mind calmed with the beginning of, not decision, but purpose. The day passed. There was nothing to do but carry on his routine, and wait for his poisoners to come to him. They knew they had only 4 days in which to act. They wouldn't waste any time. The intermediary would be Nadia or Murd. It was like 1,000 other days of his old age. All around him was movement, footsteps hurrying to and from his apartment, secretaries, department heads, police agents, an almost endless line of the people who kept him in touch with what was going on. A world of low voices telling him the monstrously many facts about a gigantic government whose every action was taken in his name. The details only had to be left out. Except for that, everything absorbed him. Trouble in Chinese Manchuria, renewed guerrilla activity in the virgin forest land of what had once been Germany, the cities controlled by the rebel general, Garson, were loosely held and were not dangerous in themselves. Very well. Go on sending them food. Of all the government scientists, only a man called Megero had a wide acquaintance among important personages in the Citadel. The old man mused aloud. Megero. That name has already come up once today. What's he like? The chief of the state police shrugged. Cultured conversationalist, abnormal though fascinating personality, but we've got nothing on him except that a lot of people go to see him. If I may ask, sir, why this interest in scientists? Arthur Clegg said slowly, to my mind, no group, either inside or outside the Citadel, would dare to act against me in this machine age without a scientific advisor. The police officer said matter-of-factly, Shall I pick him up and put on the pressure? Don't be silly, curtly. If he's a good scientist, the simple little games you play with mechanical hypnotism and lie detectors won't catch him. But your action would have meantime served to warn the bigger game. You have given me the information I desire. So far as you know, there is no secret revolutionary force operating inside the Citadel? That is correct, sir. When the police chief had gone, Arthur Clegg sat sunk in thought. There no longer seemed any doubt. His first suspicion was correct. The poisoners were his own people. It was the implication that was disturbing. Was it possible that, no matter how honorably a dictator might rule, his very existence kept in existence the violences of human power lusts, made bloodshed inevitable, and, in its intentional structure, held the seeds of a far wider, greater chaos than the democracy which, for 10 years, he had been considering restoring? It seemed so. Only, you couldn't bring back democracy, with all its implications, in 3 days. The day dragged. At 4 o'clock, Nadia, made up and glittering like a movie star, came in with a rustling of silk and a clack clack of high heels. She brushed his cheek with her perfumed lips, then lighted a cigarette and flung herself onto a settee. He thought, Nadia, poisoner, and felt a shock like fire. Earlier, the idea had been easy enough to accept, part of the life of intrigue that sinuated around him. But his great-granddaughter, the last blood tie he had with the human race. All the rest, the noble Cecily, the quiet intellectual Peter, the first and loveliest Nadia, and the others, had slipped away into their graves, leaving him alone with this sanguinary betrayer and murderess. The dark mood passed as swiftly as it had come, as Nadia said, "Grandfather, you're impossible!" Arthur Clegg studied her with abrupt but detached good humor. Nadia was 28. She had a pretty face, but her eyes were hard and bright, calculating rather than thoughtful. She had once had great influence over him, and the old man realized with a cool objectivity why that had been so. Her youth. The vibrant, purely animal spirits of a young girl had blinded him to the fact that she was just one more stranger not too cleverly out for what she could get. That was over. He waited. She went on earnestly. "Grandfather, what is in your mind? Are you going to permit the rebel Garson and that upstart Parliament which is sponsoring him, are you going to let them shove you aside? Are you giving up without a fight, letting us all go down to ridicule and ruin because of your refusal to face the fact that human nature hasn't changed?" Arthur Clegg said softly, "What would you do in my place, Nadia?" It was not an answer to her tirade. It was designed purely and simply to draw her out. Up to a few years before, whenever he had given in to her wishes, that was the question that had always preceded the act of his yielding. He saw from the way she was stiffening that she recognized The phrase. A brilliant smile lighted her berouged face. Her eyes widened, grew eager. She said urgently, "Grandfather, it is no exaggeration to say that you are probably the greatest man who has ever lived. In spite of your age and the fact that you have delegated so many of your powers, your prestige is so great that, though there is gathering confusion resulting from the rebel march on the citadel, your world is holding together. But before you, and terribly near now, is the most important decision of your life. You have your tremendously potent weapon. For 50 years you have kept it hidden, but now you must bring it forth and use it. With it you can decide what the future shall be. Megerow says there is no record in history of a decision of such importance being defaulted because of the refusal of—" "Megerow!" ejaculated Arthur Clegg. He stopped himself. "Never mind. Go on." Nadia was looking at him. "He's a horrible little man with a personality and an extraordinary self-confidence that makes him interesting in spite of his appearance. An inventor attached to the government science bureau, I believe." She hesitated. She seemed to realize that the full force of her argument had to be rebuilt now that it had been interrupted. She said, "Grandfather, in spite of all your repugnance to violence, the fact is that people have already died. If you don't kill the rebels, they will go on exterminating your loyal army and will eventually reach the citadel. I'm going to suspend judgment as to what they will do to us when they get here, but it is a point that you ought to consider. You can't just leave it to blind chance." She stopped. She drew a deep breath. Then, "You have asked me for my opinion. As plainly as I can, I want to say that I think you should disarm the rebels and then turn your weapon over to Merd. Only through him and me can your life work be saved from violent transformations. The laws of political accession are such that other groups would have to tear down at least part of the edifice that you have so carefully built up. The world might even dissolve once more into separate contending states. The death toll could reach fantastic proportions." "Can't you see?" She was so earnest that her voice trembled. "It is to our interest, and ours alone, in this wide world, to keep things as they are." "Well," she finished with an unnatural casualness, "what do you say?" It took a moment for the old man to realize that, for the time at least, she had finished. After a moment, it struck him that he was not altogether displeased with her verbal picture. For all its cool-bloodedness, it was a gentle solution to a deadly situation. For, as she had said, the choice was no longer between killing and not killing. Government soldiers had already died before the blast of atomic cannon, and, according to reports, mobile artillery had wrought havoc in the rebel ranks. Death was definitely involved. Nevertheless, only a monstrosity of a man would hand a world and its helpless people over to a gang of poisoners. He saw that Nadia, for all her return to casualness, was watching him anxiously. Arthur Clegg laughed, a silent, bitter laughter. He parted his lips, but before he could speak, the young woman said, "Grandfather, I know you've hated me ever since I married Maird. You may not be aware of that dislike, but it's there, and the reason for it is emotional. I haven't dared mention it to you before, but this is an ultimate crisis. Within 6 days, atomic cannon will be burning at this citadel, and in the fire of such a reality, not even the feelings of an old man can be spared." "Hated you," said Arthur Clegg. It was not a reaction. It was a pure expression, a sound having no origin in thought. He did note in a remote part of his mind that she had said 6 days, not 4. She apparently did not anticipate a crisis at the moment of his death. The implication that she knew nothing of the poisoning was startling. She could, of course, have such firm mental control over herself that the seemingly unconscious reaction was actually deliberate. There was no time to speak about that. Nadia was speaking. "You've hated me in a perversion of love. I was all you had, and then I got married. And, naturally, thereafter, Maird and the children came first. Grandfather, don't you see? That is why you hate me." The gathered effects of the poison made thinking hard. The old man remained stiff and, at first, hostile. He began to brace himself mentally. With a sudden, reaching effort, he threw off the queasy weight of his sickishness. Briefly, his mind drummed with energy. Thought came in the old, flashing way. He relaxed, finally, astounded. "Why, you old fool," he thought. "She's right. That is why you disliked her. Jealousy." He studied her from under shaggy eyebrows, curious, conscious that earlier impressions were now subject to revision. In many ways, Nadia's was a distinctive face, not so good-looking, but definitely aristocratic. Funny how people got that way. He himself had always had a professorish sort of countenance, and yet here was his great-granddaughter looking like a patrician. Why was it that no one had ever educed the natural is there a missing D? Educed the natural laws that would explain why the grandchildren of people who ruled all had the same expressions on their faces? Arthur Clegg shook himself and drew his mind back to Nadia. She had on, he decided after a moment, severely, too much makeup, almost as much as some of the hussies who fluttered around the citadel. You could hardly blame a woman, though, for being in style. The old man began to feel staggered. What was happening to his case against her? Here she sat, a lean, aristocratic woman, anxious to retain her high position. Who wouldn't in her place? Clever rather than intellectual, a little callous perhaps. But all people who commanded had to harden their hearts to individual suffering. He who had lived in an age where a tornado of atomic energy killed 1 billion human beings had to have as successor a person who, in the final issue, was capable of exterminating anyone daring once more to precipitate such a holocaust. And now that there was doubt as to whether Nadia was a party to the poisoning, she was again eligible. But if she and Murd weren't guilty, who was? The old man sat, shaken, uncertain. He might never find out, of course, in spite of the fact that the need to know was rapidly becoming an obsession. But he couldn't condemn anyone without proof. He said slowly, "Leave me now, Nadia. You have presented your case well, but I have not decided. Tomorrow I intend to— Never mind." He waited till, with puzzled side glances, she had left. Then he picked up his private radio phone. It took a moment to establish the connection. Then, "Well," said Arthur Clegg. The police chief's voice came. "The arrangements are made. The meeting will take place in no man's land. He agrees to the presence of— Oh, whoops, wrong voice. The arrangements are made. The meeting will take place in no man's land. He agrees to the presence of 3 bodyguards." The officer broke off. "Sir, this is a most dangerous business. If anything should go wrong—" The old man said curtly, "You are having the mobile outfitted according to my instructions?" Mobile? Mobile outfitted according to my instructions? "Yes, but—" Earnestly, "Sir, I ask again, what is your purpose in talking to General Garson?" The old man only smiled tightly and hung up. He had not one but 2 purposes in meeting Garson. It wouldn't do to tell anyone that his first purpose was to hear the case of the rebels. As for his second reason— His smile deepened. No use broadcasting that, either. "Remember," said Arthur Clegg to his chief officer, "take no action till I tug at my ear." The unpleasant part of the whole business was walking 50 feet from his mobile to where the tables and chairs had been set up in the open meadow. Every step he took twisted his insides. Gasping, he sank into one of the chairs. He was beginning to recover when a lanky individual in an all-fitting blue uniform descended the steps of the second mobile and strode across the grass. The man's movements had all the awkward freedom of the unrestrained extrovert. Recognition was unmistakable. The lean, bony face with its lantern jaw had already stared at him several times from photographs. Even without the countenance, the nasal twanged voice, which had twice broadcast on the radio, would have made the identification inevitable. Rebel General Garson was photo and vocogenic. He said, "Old man, I hope you haven't got some slick scheme up your sleeve." It was loudly said, too loudly to be polite. But Arthur Clegg was too intent, too curious to notice. Nor did he think immediately of replying. He was conscious of a genuine absorption in this man who dared to oppose the irresistible weapon. Garson had brown eyes and uncombed, sandy hair. He sank into his chair and stared unsmilingly at his aged opponent. Once more it was Garson who spoke, snappingly this time. "Get to the point, man." Arthur Clegg hardly heard. Nor did the details of physical appearance interest him now. It was the man, his boldness in organizing a small army in a vast land, his defiance of death for an ideal that almost, in itself, merited success for his enterprise. Slowly, the old man straightened his anguished body, said with dignity, "General Garson, as you will notice, I am recognizing your military title. To me you represent a trend of thought in the country. And as a result I might, if you can give me some dialectical arguments, allow Parliament to be re-established under your mentorship. I am not opposed to democracy, because, except for the disaster in which it involved itself half a century ago, it was a vigorous, marvelously growing organism. I have no doubt it can be so again. The danger is the free use of atomic energy. Don't worry about that. Garson waved a gaunt hand. My Congress and I will keep it to ourselves. Ugh. Arthur Clegg stared across the table, not sure that he had heard correctly. He had the sudden blank feeling that meaningless words had been projected at him. Before he could speak or think further, the lanky man leaned forward. The small brown eyes peered at him. See here, Mr. Dictator Clegg, I don't know just what you had in mind asking me to come over. I thought maybe you wanted to surrender now that I've called your bluff. Here's my offer. I understand you've some kind of estate down south. Okay, I'll let you and your granddaughter and family live there under guard. If anybody starts something, naturally, they get killed. My Congress will set me up as president, and I'll just slip into your position as quickly as I can. In a few months, everything will be going along smooth as ever. That clear? The shock was greater. There seemed nothing to think. At last, Arthur Clegg expostulated. But see here, you haven't got a Congress yet. A Congress is a governing body elected by secret ballot by the vote of all the people. 200 men can't just organize and call themselves Congress. They. His voice trailed as the implications penetrated of what he was saying. It seemed incredible, but was this man so ignorant of history that he didn't know what representative government was? The old man tried to picture that. The psychology of it finally grew plausible. Like so many human beings, Garson was only dimly aware that there had been life before his own ego emerged from the mists of childhood. To him, that pre-Garson period must be an unsubstantial hodgepodge. Somehow the words Congress and President had come down to him, and he had made his own definitions. With an effort, Arthur Clegg drew his attention back to Garson. And the thought came finally. After all, it was the courage of this creature that was fascinating. The courage of this creature. Bleh. After all, it was the courage of this creature. Why can't I say creature? Good golly. After all, it was the courage of this creature that was fascinating. A man who had the boldness to defy the weapon must be amenable to reason and to a partial re-education. Boy, Garson's voice twanged. You sure have been smart, Clegg. All these years pretending you had a super weapon and fixing up books and motion pictures and things to make people think it all happened the way you said. You never fooled me, though. And so now you've had your day. I'll sure carry on with that weapon game, though. His voice went on, but Arthur Clegg did not listen. He waited until the sound stopped, and then with a casual gesture tugged at his ear. He saw Garson stiffen as the mechanical hypnotic waves struck at him. The old man wasted no time. Garson, he intoned. Garson, you will be glad to tell me who gave you the blueprints for atomic cannon. Garson, was it someone in the government? Garson, it is so easy to tell me. But I do not know. The man's voice was far away somehow, and vaguely surprised. They were given me by a man I do not know. He said he was an agent. An agent. An agent for whom? Arthur Clegg pressed. I do not know. But didn't you care? Didn't it worry you? No, I figured as soon as I had the cannon, the other guy would have to start worrying. After 3 minutes, Arthur Clegg tugged at his ear again, and Garson came back to normal life. He looked a little startled, but the old man was not worried about the suspicions of so completely ignorant a man. He said icily, Since I gave you my word, mister, you may depart at once in perfect safety. I would advise you, however, to keep on traveling, because tomorrow no one in the vicinity of an atomic cannon will be alive. In any event, I shall advise, pause, my son-in-law, my heir and successor, to hunt you down and have you brought to justice. He was thinking as he finished. There was no time for further choice. The house was one of a row of pleasant mansions that stood amid greenery in the shadow of the towering peak of building that was the citadel. The outer door must have opened by remote electrical control, because, when Dr. Parker had gone through, he found himself in a narrow metal hallway. A tiny bulb in the ceiling shed a white glow upon a second door, which was all metal. The doctor stood motionless. Then he called shrilly, "Meadow, what's all this?" There was a mechanical chuckle from one of the walls.
Don't get excited, Doctor. As you know, the whole situation is now entering the critical stage, and I am taking no chances.
But I've been here 100 times before, and I've never seen any of this fortification.
Good.
Megero's voice came again through the wall speaker. He sounded pleased.
It would take an atomic cannon, or, pause, Arthur Clagg's contradictory force to blast me out of this. But come in.
The second door opened into a paneled hallway and clanged behind Parker. A small man was waiting there for him. He chuckled as he saw Parker, then said curtly,
Well, your report, man. You administered the poison substitute successfully?
The doctor did not reply as he followed the other into the living room. These first moments in the presence of Megero always made him uneasy. Adjustment from normalness to unnormalness was a semi-involved process. It wasn't so much, Parker realized bleakly for the 100th time, that Megero's ugliness by itself was so jarring. 1,000 males picked up at random from the streets outside would have yielded a dozen, whose physical characteristics were less prepossessing. Megero differed in that he exuded a curious, terrible aura of misshapen strength. His personality protruded with the concreteness of the hump of a hunchback. It seemed to make him not quite human. Parker had discovered that, by letting only the corner of his eyes be aware of the man, he could stand in his presence. And that was what he did now, and said, "Yes, I administered the substitute 2 nights ago. As I told you, the pain effects will be the same as with the real poison." The image in the corner of the doctor's vision stood stock still. Then,
He thinks he will die after 4 days?
"Yes, and his reaction was to swear me to secrecy." He broke off anxiously. "Are you sure, are you absolutely sure that you can nullify his weapon long enough to seize control of it? How can you be positive that he will even use it?" Megero clicked his tongue impatiently.
Of course I'm not sure. I am basing my estimations on the character of a man whose actions, speeches, and writings I have studied for years. At this very moment, I'll warrant the old man has practically decided to use the weapon in one way or another. In my opinion, he will use it to act against the rebels, and will then turn the weapon over to his son-in-law. This is all to the good. I want him to stamp out the rebel force before I move against him. In my opinion, the crisis will be tomorrow. If I read Arthur Clegg aright, he will by now have sought a meeting with General Garson, the rebel leader. He will have found a man who embodies the worst features of the demagogue. And, besides, Garson has dared to use atomic power. That, as I have told you, will balance in the old man's mind his suspicion that his great-granddaughter helped to poison him. Oh, yes, he'll use the weapon, and that, the little monstrosity of a man chuckled, is where I come in. Little did Arthur Clegg realize 50 years ago that he established a precedent and became the first, not the last, of the scientist leaders is. Now that men's minds accept such a possibility, scientists will begin to think in that direction, unconsciously molding their lives and their works with the hope of power in their minds. Such are the laws of dialectical materialism. But now I must. He broke off. His voice lost its sustained quality of intensity, grew quiet. Thanks for coming, Doctor. As you know, we couldn't take the chance of a phone call being intercepted, particularly as the secret police have been making guarded inquiries about me. As they shook hands, Meadow, his blue eyes glistening, said, "You have done well, Parker. I'm sorry you were too squeamish to use the real poison, but that can be remedied when I get into power. As it is, your assistance in helping me force the old man to bring out his weapon will gain you the reward you desire. Arthur Clagg's great-granddaughter, Nadia, will be given you in marriage as soon as her husband has been decently disposed of." "Thank you," said Parker quietly. Contemptuous-eyed, the little man watched him go. He thought coldly, silly ass doctor. Couldn't he see that the public necessities of the situation required that the only legitimate heir of the former dictator marry the new ruler? Pawns didn't take queens. Speed was essential. He sent the invitations to Merd and Nadia for that afternoon. They arrived shortly after lunch. In spite of himself, the old man found himself staring searchingly at his son-in-law, seeking in the man's lean face reassurance that the colossal trust he was about to receive would not be misused. He saw gray eyes, dark hair, a rather fine, sensitive face with stern lips, exactly the same physical characteristics, the same person he had so violently disliked from the very first announcement of Nadia's betrothal. The body, not the mind, was visible. It was not enough. The thought was a pain briefly greater than the agony of the poison. And yet, the decision was made. A man with 2 days to live couldn't think of anything but the easy solution. Arthur Clegg said curtly, "Lock all the doors. We're going to uncover the weapon. It will require most of the afternoon." Merd said explosively, "You mean it's here?" The old man ignored that. He went on drably. "The weapon is mounted inside a plastic airplane powered by 4 gas turbine jets and strato rockets. This machine is hidden in the east wing of the Citadel, which, as you perhaps know, was built by workers from every part of the world. The employment of men from far places who did not speak the same language made it possible to construct a hiding place without anyone guessing its true purpose." He broke off, fumbled in his coat pocket, and produced a key. "This will unlock a tool cupboard next to my bathroom. Bring the tools in here. You will need them all to uncover and then activate the mechanical keys that will open the hidden chamber." It took time, the two young people silent and intent on their unaccustomed work, carting machine saws, atomic drills, mobile planes into various indicated parts of the living room. When all the tools were gathered, the old man motioned them to the settee near him, and began. "There's been a great deal of wild talk about the nature of my weapon. The speculation is quite unnecessary, because many years ago I very foolishly gave out some of the theory in a series of articles published in the Government Science Gazette. It was foolish, not because anyone will be able to duplicate the weapon, but because—" He broke off, frowning. "Never mind. I'll explain that later." He went on, quietly. "The theory behind the contradiction force penetrates to the inner core of the meanings of life and of movement. Life, as you know, has been defined as orderly movement. There is movement also in inorganic matter, but this is a primitive version and is explained by the larger concept. What makes movement possible? Why does not matter, organic or inorganic, simply collapse into its basic components and, thus inert, fulfill its apparently senseless destiny? You might answer that things are as they are because electrons whirl in orbits according to fixed laws, forming atoms which, in their turn, have a physically legal relationship to the larger structure of the molecules, and so on. But that would be merely evading the issue. Movement occurs in an object because in it, in its very basic oneness, there is an antithesis, a contradiction. It is only because a thing contains a contradiction within itself that it moves and acquires impulse and activity. The theory by itself suggested the nature of the research. I found first what were the laws governing the contradiction in various types of matter, and I shall give you the mathematics in due course. The mechanical problem of practicalizing the theory, involved in its simplest functions, and the procuration of a force that would cause the contradiction in any given matter to operate, not in the orderly fashions that nature has laboriously evolved, but uncontrollably. Those who have not seen it in action cannot imagine how terrible the result is. It is not, has no relation to, atomic energy. As a destructive force, the hellish active area in the interior of a nova sun possibly equals it in violence, but such a sun cannot even theoretically surpass it. Fortunately, heat is not a byproduct, as would be the case if the force was related to atomic or electrical energy. It was only long after the weapon was an actuality that I discovered that I had hit on a billion to one chance, that my discovery was an accident that cannot be repeated in a million years. Tomorrow you will see it in action. He paused and frowned, partly with pain, partly because the weapon has only one aspect that is dangerous to us. It can be nullified by a simple electrically induced magnetic flow in the object on which it is focused. That is why I was foolish in giving out the theory. Some day, somewhere, a smart scientist will discover the nullifying principle, and the weapon will cease to be a factor in world politics. I must confess I have worried about that in the dark watches of many nights. But now, he straightened slowly, let us get to work. Minute by minute, as the hours passed, his choice seemed more and more final. The third day dawned cloudless. It was one of those brightly perfect spring mornings. The world below the plain was a gorgeous panorama of emerging green. Even now, with the anguish tearing at his body, it was hard for Arthur Clegg to realize that, in this setting of eternally youthful soil, his mortality was seeking its final ecstasy of expression. They came to the rebel lines and began to circle. The telescopes showed metal glinting among the trees below, and Arthur Clegg, with Nadia leaning over his shoulder, examined the maps the army had supplied. Climb higher, he ordered finally. And again, minutes later, higher. After 10 minutes more, higher. But we're up about 35 miles, Merd protested. We've already used up 3/4 of our rocket fuel. Higher, said the old man inexorably. The problem at all times with this weapon is to remain clear of the explosion. When I first estimated mathematically its power, I hardly believed my figures. Fortunately, I had the sense to rig up a device that would cut off the force after 1/1,000,000th of a second. If I do that now, and set this dial to metal, only the outermost rim of atoms on the one cannon below that I'm aiming at will be affected. He finished. When you have 5 minutes fuel left, tell me. Merd's voice came over the earphones. Less than 5 minutes left now. I'll have to turn over the jets. Steady.
I'll have to turn over to the jets.
Steady, said Arthur Clegg.
He had left the telescopic sights and was swinging the gun around, locking it into place. Once more he looked through the sights. He pressed the trigger. The ground below turned bluer than the sky. For a long moment it looked like a placid lake in a glacier. Then the lake was gone, and where there had been trees and green beauty was a gray black hole 30 miles in diameter. Desert. "Grandfather!" Nadia cried. "The gun is swinging back. It'll hit you." The old man did not move from the sights. The gun swung in a 180-degree arc and clicked back into position just beside his head. He said, without looking up, "It's all right. I made it that way." A moment longer he looked, then he straightened. Awareness came that the plane was shuddering with speed, the jets whistling shrilly. He sat down. He leaned back, weary, feeling strangely old. Slowly he straightened, fighting the pain and the fatigue. Merritt's voice came over the phones.
Grandfather, there's news coming through from the Citadel. Some idiot has started a revolution. Listen.
A strange voice sounded.
A rebellion in the Air Force. Uprising in the Citadel garrison. With fighting now going on in the gardens. A man named Medjero has declared himself to be the new dictator.
There was more, but Arthur Clagg's mind followed it no further. Medjero. Funny how the name had come up so often in the last few days, almost like predestination. Nadia had mentioned him, and Dr. Parker, and... The old man sagged a little. Parker. Poison. For a moment, the connection seemed impossible. What could be the man's motive? Except for a tendency to lose control of his emotions, Parker was a timid, cautious fellow with a reasonably good mind. Arthur Clegg sighed. There was no use thinking about it. Medjero had precipitated a palace revolution before the arrival of Garson. Like Garson, the new usurper was apparently not taking the slightest notice of an old man and his mythical contradictory force. Perhaps he should have announced in advance his intention to use it. No use worrying about that now. The die was cast, and there were things to do. He straightened.
Nadia.
Yes, grandfather?
Jump.
He had almost forgotten that people never disobeyed him when he took that tone, that manner. It was so long since he had used it. One measured look she gave him. Then she was running forward to Merd. She came back, tears in her eyes. Her lips touched his. She said, I shall join the children at the lodge, and I will wait till I hear from you. He watched her fall into the blue haze. It was 5 minutes later that Merd's voice came over the radio.
There's some planes following us, grandfather. What?
3 times Arthur Clegg pressed the trigger of the contradictory force weapon, but the planes came on, untouched, unharmed. At last, he whispered his defeat over the phone.
Better obey their signal, Merd, and go down. There's nothing we can do.
They were actually landing before he realized that he was still holding the weapon. He stared down grimly at the now useless double cone, and then let it slip clear of his fingers. He watched it swing back in its 180-degree arc and click metallically into its rest position. It lay in its cradle, still omnipotent under the right conditions. But by the time it was used again, Merd and he would be dead, and the law and order world he had created would be scrambled by the passions of men. And it would take 100 years to put all the pieces together again. The devil of it, the irony, was that Medjero had no reason to use it immediately. He felt the plane settling on its jets. Gently it touched the ground. Merd left the controls and came back to him immediately.
They're signaling us to get off, he said quietly.
Arthur Clegg nodded. In silence, they climbed to the ground. They were about 100 feet away when the other planes began to disgorge men, most of whom carried tubes of rocket fuel to the big plane. One of the men, however, a tall chap in an Air Force uniform, came over. He said insolently,
The Medjero orders that you be searched.
"The Megero." Maird submitted stonily, but the old man watched the procedure with a bleak admiration for its thoroughness. When the man had finished, Arthur Clegg said, "Satisfy my curiosity. Why did you rebel?" The officer shrugged.
The deadness you created was killing my will to live. The Medjero is going to release atomic energy. We're going to the planets, perhaps even the stars, in my lifetime.
When the officer had gone, Arthur Clegg turned to Maird and said, "My desire for order grew out of the hideous misuse of atomic energy. But I always knew that man was the contradictory force of the organic universe, and that, sooner or later, for better or for worse, he must again be allowed to play with the ultimate fire. Apparently, the time has come." A small man was climbing out of the nearest plane. He carried an atomic in one hand. He came forward briskly, and even though he had never seen Megero before, it seemed to Arthur Clegg that he would have recognized him anywhere, without any more description than he had already received by chance. Maird was speaking distastefully.
I've discovered that, letting only the corner of my eyes be aware of him, I can stand his presence for a while.
It was an odd and altogether fascinating statement. The words drew the old man's attention briefly away from Megero. He felt momentarily absorbed by the insight they gave into Maird's character. He found himself liking his son-in-law better. There was no time to think about either Maird or his words. Megero stood before them. He looked unnormal. It wasn't so much, Arthur Clegg decided bleakly, that Megero's ugliness was jarring in itself. 1,000 males picked at random would have yielded a dozen whose physical characteristics were less prepossessing. Perhaps it was the triumphant smile on his face, with its frank and unashamed arrogance. It was hard to tell. The man exuded a curious, terrible aura of misshapen strength. His personality protruded with the concreteness of a hump, of the hump of a hunchback. Gazing at him, old Arthur Clegg felt a chill, a sick consciousness of the extent of his failure. It seemed incredible that he had let himself be panicked into using his weapon, and had not once suspected that that was exactly what his hidden enemy was working for. He thought, the Megero, heir of the earth. The very idea was shattering. Megero broke the silence, coolly.
In a moment I shall get into your plane and start climbing. As soon as I have reached a safe height, I shall fire at this.
He drew a strip of metal from his pocket and tossed it onto the ground.
With your weapon. I like ironies like that.
For a moment, the old man could not believe that he had heard aright. The intention, so deliberately stated, was so far-reaching in its implications, so unexpected, that it seemed impossible. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The hope that came shook his very bones. It had no parallel in the long history of his career. It was Maird who finally reacted vocally. Maird who said violently,
"But there's a city of 50,000 over there, about 8 miles. You can't fire the weapon so near it."
Arthur Clegg fumbled at Maird's arm. He wanted to tell the young fool to stop arguing. Couldn't he see that Megero was playing into their hands? But of course he couldn't. Maird didn't know the fear that had in the long ago made his great-grandfather-in-law install the weapon in the way he had. Before he could decide how to stop Merd cried,
Put a bullet through Put a bullet through our brains, you murderer! You can't destroy a whole city! You can't!
Once more, in a haze of anxiety now, Arthur Clegg parted his lips to utter words that would silence Merd. Just in time he saw the look on Megero's face, and closed them again. No words were needed. The best ally he had in this fateful moment was the Megero himself. The little man stood, head flung back proudly. His eyes blazed with sardonic joy. He said,
I shall not make the mistakes of the new princes of history. I have no desire to be dragged, as was Cromwell, out of my grave and hanged as a public spectacle. Nor shall I be so slow in starting my executions as were the early French revolutionists. And as for those talkative idiots, Felix Pyat and Delecluse, in 1871 Paris, it makes me sick just to think about them. Mussolini allowed himself to be caught in the same net. He permitted his potential destroyers and betrayers to remain alive. Hitler, of course, had half his work done for him when the Allies rid Germany of the Hohenzollern dynasty. Oh my gosh, why am I mangling these? Hohenzollern dynasty. He made only one mistake. Russia. Everybody's plans were naturally blown sky high when atomic energy appeared on the scene.
Immeasurably savage grew his voice.
Force and terror, those are the weapons that win when there are no undefeated armies extant to support opposition groups. I shall use the weapon on you because I have to test its operation anyway. I shall do this here and now because nothing will better convince the world of my unalterable determinations than the destruction of a city. So true is this, that, if the city had not been to hand, it would have been necessary for me to transport all of us to its vicinity.
He finished cynically.
It will be a simple matter, once I am established, to propagandize people into believing that it was you, not I, who destroyed it.
You can't do this, cried Merd wildly. It's not human. It's...
Firmly, this time, the old man caught his arm. Merd, he said resonantly, can't you see it's useless? We're dealing with a man who has a plan, a settled policy of conquest. The remark seemed to please Megero. He said with satisfaction,
That's right. Argument is useless. I never missed a bet in my strategy. You did everything exactly as I intended you to. Your decision had to be made too swiftly. You had no time to think.
My foolishness, said Arthur Clegg quietly, was in thinking all these days and years that there was a decision to be made. I've just realized that, actually, I made my choice long and long ago. I chose, not self, but the good of all mankind, whereas you have chosen self.
Eh!
Megero looked at him sharply, as if searching for a hidden meaning. Then he laughed. Then he said arrogantly,
Enough of this chatter. You ruined yourself 20 years ago, Arthur Clegg, when you ignored the letters sent you by a struggling science student, myself. I realize now you probably didn't even receive them, but that excuse doesn't apply to later years when powerful friends tried to draw my work to your attention and you wouldn't even look at it.
He was suddenly livid with rage. He spat.
20 years of obscurity. During the next 20 minutes, I'll let you think of what might have been if you had treated me from the beginning according to my merits.
He whirled away. The plane door clanged behind him. The gas turbines whined. The jets hissed. Lightly, swiftly, the plane rose into the sky. It became a dot. After a minute, the other planes took off, and the two men were alone. There was a long silence. At last, cold and contemptuous, Merd said,
This creature cannot see that you are not, and never were, his type of dictator. The history of democracies teaches that in emergencies people will temporarily surrender their liberties. No greater emergency ever existed than the release of atomic energy. The period of control has been a long one, because the world had to be reorganized and, like a new mold, allowed to set. In my considered opinion, the people are ready again to take over, and no one, not Megero, not me, not all the force anyone can possibly exert, will stop them.
"Why, Merd," said Arthur Clegg, "I didn't know you felt like that. In fact, you have provided me with a whole series of pleasant shocks. Under pressure, you have showed a very great number of golden attributes. Accordingly, I herewith commission you to begin re-establishing democracy as soon as we return to the citadel." The young man was staring at him wildly. Then he swallowed hard. At last, shakily, he asked,
What did you say? Back to the citadel?
Arthur Clegg felt a sudden sympathy for his grandson-in-law, a sharp understanding of the agonized turmoil being experienced by a man who had geared himself to death, and now was confronted by the possibility of life. It seemed curiously important that Merd suffer no more than he had to. The old man said grimly,
I was terrified that some day the contradictory force would be set off accidentally. I therefore constructed the weapon so that its muzzle resembled its stock. I placed it so that it would swing around automatically after I had fired it, and point up towards the sky or towards any stranger who might be impelled to fire it. That is the position it is in this very moment, as Megero stands aiming it.
Old Arthur Clegg finished in a ringing tone.
Not with Megero, but in your hands, Merd, lies the destiny of mankind.
He did not know then that the poison inside him was only a substitute, and that he would be the wise old mentor of the new and lusty civilization of the stars. The end. And that was Heir Apparent by A.E. Van Vogt. And here at the bottom of the page, you can see an old advertisement for thin Gillette blades. You ease off beard and jig time, men. With thin Gillettes, 4 blades for 10, they save you dough and treat you well. And your face sure looks and feels swell. Produced by the maker of the famous Gillette Blue Blade. 4 for 10 cents. So, good times. Good times. Hope people dug that. It's a cute one. Again, 1945, so views on particularly female sexuality and females in general are a bit dated, painfully so. But yeah, it's cute. Let's see. Oh, geez, yeah. How long is schedules? Is schedule? If it's about the same length, it's totally fine. I'll do that. Oh, yeah, that's fine. We'll do that. Whoops, wrong one. Wait, no, maybe, yes, sure. So yeah, I guess we'll do Schedule by Harry Walton, whose name is not ringing a bell. Harry Walton, Harry Walton, Harry Walton. Wikipedia, I choose you. Harry Walton, Harry Walton. Writer. In Travelers of Space. Travelers of Space is a 19... Yeah, I can't find anything directly on Harry Walton himself. He did write a story that's in an anthology called Travelers of Space. Harry Walton. Actually, that's got quite a bunch of pretty big names. Ray Bradbury, Paul Anderson, Von Vogt again, Ed Cartier, whose name I've seen before, Hal Clement, whose name I've seen before, Frederick Arnold Kummer. I don't know that name. Martin Greenberg is familiar as well. I think because he did a couple of these maybe. Oh, he was the editor. Okay, yeah. Okay. So I have no idea who Harry Walton is. It's not a familiar name to me, but that's fine. But we're gonna read Schedule by Harry Walton.
I have no idea what's in this story. I've not read it before, so I'm reading it blind.
I am going to need more water. Yes, I am. Okay, give me 30 seconds. I'll be right back. All right, sorry about that. Schedule by Harry Walton. Schedules are funny things. If you have it figured right, you can break a man by taking over his schedule. But if you have it figured wrong, it can turn out that 2 plus 2 is 0 instead of 4. In the Medusa's shadowy forecabin, lumen tubes flickered as the ship staggered under the first thrust of the hyper-accelerators. Then she was over the hump, and the tubes burned brighter than they yet had, while energy surged from every atom of the ship, its cargo animate and inanimate, so that Carlson... Oh, what? Hey-oh! Into the Carlson accumulators. Four men looked at one another, tensely expectant as of something certain to come, something familiar yet always to be awaited with trepidation. Deep in the metallic cavern that was the ship, machinery screamed suddenly on a new, rising note. With the first sharp wail came the familiar sensation of falling, pure illusion, yet no less convincing for that. The Medusa seemed to be sliding down a precipitous slope at gathering speed. The feeling would last for hours, but its coming eased that other psychological tension that preceded it. The subthird spat cheerfully and unzipped his fatigue suit. "That's that until next time. Save the Carlsons. I wonder why I stay on this run anyway." Since the other three couldn't answer that question for themselves, none tried to answer it for the subthird. But it seemed to make the second oiler even more thoughtful than usual, for he took the pipe out of his mouth. Seeing that he was going to talk, even the subthird paused in the act of rolling into his bunk. "Save the Carlsons," muttered the oiler. "They'll hold up this trip and 100 more.
You can spend a lifetime on these tubs and never run into anything tougher than a hard-boiled second. Dangerous? You should have been a wildcatter back in the old days. There was the run to Rhea. If you want to kill part of the off-watch, I'll tell you the yarn.
"Aye, tell it," said the sub-third for all of them. The second oiler hadn't always been a fore-cabin hand, and sometimes his yarns were worth hearing. Deliberately, he knocked the ashes from his pipe into the refuse well. The soft rustle of air through the ventilator grill grew out of the stillness, only to fade again before the oiler's voice.
Nowadays, you don't hear much about Rhea. The main liners still run to Titan. There's not enough beyond Saturn to keep traffic lively out there, and the Carlsons make it easier to get to Antares in a subship than to reach Uranus in a jet ship. Even Titan's just a tourist shop today, and Rhea's pointed out to the rubbernecks as a moon to steer clear of. The guides tell 'em what would happen to 'em 6 hours after grounding there, and they enjoy a few shivers before going back to their bridge games. That's all Rhea means now. Bismullah's a cargo you'll never hear about, and Interplan Council sends the Rheans all the salt and sodium they want by a B9 automatic, which is cheaper and a lot safer than sending a cruise ship. But in the old days, it was different. Titan itself was a pretty tough place for a youngster green from navigation school like Jimmy Rogers. It was tough enough without the news that he had to hear when he landed from the big blue starship at Titan Dock. So that's it, son, Matthews was saying, and I never hated to tell you anything more than this. Your dad was a fine, honest man and a good navigator. God rest his soul.
Jimmy Rogers swallowed dryly. The bustling scene all around him, the hurrying foot traffic of a great space dock, the fussy activity of automatic unloaders, all seemed suddenly as unreal and absurd as the news Matthews had brought him. Alive, moving, noisy, but not actual, like a stereograph sound film. It couldn't be true that his father was dead. Things couldn't happen that way, after all the years of planning towards this day. But in a coldly sober compartment of his mind, he knew that it was so. Men didn't live forever, not even men like Ben Rogers, the father he hadn't seen in 7 years. Funny how much the same he felt as on the day he'd left Titan, a kid of 16, alone and awkward and self-conscious in his new whipcords and plastoid cap. But most of all, alone. Now he had master's papers and a certificate of competency, but felt just as alone. Bitterly, he wished he'd never left Titan. To come back to this. Matthews was studying him anxiously. Now he saluted, the same offhand yet respectful gesture he'd used toward the elder Rogers. Ooh, sorry.
Begging your pardon, son. We can't stay here. Would you let me stand you to a drink?
Rogers nodded, followed the grizzled engine man through the ordered confusion of the landing stage, down a long plank walk, and into a dark little tavern. Afterward, he couldn't remember the way he had come. A glass was set before him. He swallowed its stinging, tasteless contents while his mind remorselessly rehearsed the news. The funeral had been 3 days ago. He'd missed it by that much. He wished he were 16 again, and just feeling the hard clasp of his father's hand in that goodbye 7 years ago. Matthews was blinking at him across the table. The old spaceman leaned forward.
Guess I know how you feel, son. He was my friend. But now we've got to get on course. It's what he'd ask of you if you were here. And there's not much time.
The words penetrated a haze of self-pity. He'd been acting, Rogers saw, exactly as that kid of 16 would have. Time he took himself in hand. Sorry, of course I'll carry on. How long since your last voyage?
Too long, son. I've had the devil's time with the Interplan Council. The beacon isn't good for much longer. And I hadn't the authority to take cargo without you, even if I had had a navigator.
We'll load at once. I'll see the council right away, too. My papers are in order. Are the beacon batteries aboard?
Matthews swallowed visibly, his gnarled fingers tracing an intricate scroll pattern on the dirty tablecloth.
No, son, they ain't. Fact is, I've got to tell you some things I'd rather not. You got here just in time, but it's not all clear landings. First off,
Blast me if it isn't young Rogers!
Roared a bull-like voice as a bulky figure loomed over the table.
Remember me, Nappy Ames? Say, I'm sorry about your dad. Swell chap, one of the best.
The man pulled a chair out, sat down so hard it creaked in protest. He was fat, but hard beneath the fat, his face space tanned, the eyes full of a shrewdness that belied his blustering good humor. Rogers remembered him vaguely as a wildcatter who hauled ore from Iapetus, outermost moon but one of Saturn. His father had written once that Ames had offered to buy a share in the Stardust, although the man already had a ship of his own.
Ah, you were a kid when I saw you last, the man bellowed amiably. Just a raw kid. Now you're all set, eh? A real navigator. Going to show us old chaps a few things?
He winked broadly at Matthews, who made no response.
Well, I hope you do. We can stand it. Competition's the life of this racket, I always say.
Rogers forced himself to look at the other squarely. He disliked what he saw, resented Ames' manner, the offhand reference to his father's death. I don't suppose I'll add to your competition, he told Ames. The Stardust is sticking to the Rhea run. So far as I'm concerned, the other moons are all yours. The big man's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. He turned to Matthews.
Mean to tell me you haven't explained things? Haven't had the chance with you butting in, Matthews growled. If you get out, maybe I can make 'em clear. Sure, sure. No harm meant.
The big man heaved himself up off the chair.
Sorry, Rogers, to have butted in too soon. Matthews will tell you my proposition. Better think it over.
He walked off with the mincing gait of a spaceman accustomed to low gravity. Rogers waited until he was out of earshot, then turned to Matthews, who spread his broad hands flat on the tablecloth in a gesture of finality.
okay, here it is. The Council isn't transferring the beacon run to you just like that. Ames has bid in for it. Would have had it by now if you weren't your dad's son, but you'll have to race Ames for it.
Race?
That's it. After all, son, you're new in this game, even though your dad pioneered on Rhea. The Council doesn't know you, and that beacon's got to be serviced regular. They know Ames can deliver, but they agreed to wait until you got here to take over the Stardust, and to let you and Ames start neck and neck. First one to reach Rhea and flash a code signal from the beacon gets the contract.
Who else is bidding?
Nobody. Them other wildcatters wouldn't land on Rhea for all the bismillah the Rheans can dig up. Takes nerve to ground on a moon you can't stay healthy on more than 6 hours. Too much can go wrong. 3 of Ames's men quit, but he got a legal crew left. Although I don't think there's another spaceman this side of Mars which'll sign up for the run. Of course, Ames has plenty of guts. He'd go to Hades and back if there was profit in it. Only reason he never tried to butt in before was that your dad had the beacon contract, which paid 80% of the expenses and would make it plenty tough for anybody to undersell him on the bismillah end, which Ames figures will work 2 ways, if he can get the contract.
What's that proposition he talked about? Asked Rogers. Matthews cracked his knuckles.
Didn't figure you'd be interested in that, son, but maybe you will be after you've applied for cargo. Your dad could get credit on any trip for salt and sodium to trade the Rheans. Well, I asked for cargo, but they said no. Trouble is, son, they don't know you or what kind of navigator you are. You'll have to put up with the Stardust as security. You'll have to put up the Stardust as security for cargo.
What's Ames's proposition? Asked Rogers again.
He'll buy the Stardust, Matthews told him, for 80,000 credits. And he has the gall to offer to let you captain her on the Iapetus run. all in fertilizer. Titan was dwindling behind. Ahead lay the glory of ringed Saturn, a fantasy of the heavens, pale yellow in color, its surface just now leprous with white spots that betokened a storm in its atmosphere. Against the brilliant disk, Rhea was a black dot. A smell of hot condenser oil and jet fuel permeated the stardust. The engines were working hard, but they were giving Ames a good run for his money. The scope still showed his comet abreast of the stardust, about 100 miles away. The ships were too closely matched for either to win much advantage on this long leg of the journey. Closer in to Rhea, when landing approaches had to be plotted, better spaceman would better spacemanship would count. Rogers had worked out that part of the trip with special care. The aft bulkhead door creaked open, letting the roar of the engines well out from the after part of the ship. Matthews entered the navigation cubby, his face troubled.
"We're pushing her hard, son," he complained. "The turbos are heating. They won't take any overload on decelerating."
Won't have to. We'll cut in the gravity screens in reverse. Rogers jabbed a thumb portwise. Ames is shoving his ship, too, and if we don't win, there won't be any stardust left, so far as we're concerned.
Bad as that, son?
It's a one-shot proposition, as you expected. I got cargo by putting the ship up as security. If we don't move it, I'll have to take a market loss. And there's nothing to pay it with. Dad spent all his ready cash putting me through school and was blasting on pretty thin jets financially. But we've got the cargo and the beacon batteries and a coded identification tape. All we have to do now is beat Ames. Matthews grunted and vanished into the smelly depths of the engine room. For the fifth time, Rogers checked course and speed. The Council, he pondered grimly, was getting a good race, and a long one. Rhea and Titan had been 3 days' journey apart when the two ships started. The smaller moon's baleful disk was growing ever larger now against the huge one of Saturn. Rhea, second of the planet's 2 alien moons, beautiful at this distance, treacherous, deadly. Rogers was proud that his father had been first deliberately to risk a landing on the green moon, first to establish an understanding with its non-human inhabitants, even though he had had to leave a few hours later, in obedience to the grim warning of his radiation detectors. For Rhea was a moon of death to mankind. The other moons, Titan, Iapetus, Thetis, Dione, were normal. A ship caught in Saturn's gravitational net might, with good fortune, land on any of them and await rescue. But Rhea, in such a case, offered safety with one hand and death with the other. Some theories had it that the green moon was a wanderer from outside, captured by Saturn, whereas the other satellites were born of the planet's own vast bulk. Rhea was dangerously radioactive. Far harder than X-rays, more penetrating even than cosmic rays, its emanations disintegrated brain tissue after a few hours' exposure. No personal armor, no ship's hull offered safety from them. Before the beacon was set up, more than one ship had made its last landing on Rhea to become the sarcophagus of its crew. Biological experiments had since set the maximum safe exposure at 6 hours. Successive exposures had to be at least 230 hours apart to avoid a cumulative effect. Hence, the beacon to warn ships away from this treacherous haven. Hence also the periodic inspection and servicing of the beacon at a safe interval of 240 hours. A sudden hooting of the collision indicator roused Rogers from these thoughts. 3 blasts, followed by 4 shorter ones, the universal interplanetary danger signal. It was followed by the code signal for Rhea. Few spacemen would continue on the course the Stardust now held. He took a reading on the intensity meter, checking its findings against his navigation figures. 12 hours from Rhea. On the astrogator, he deftly set up the coordinates for the first landing crew. The machine rumbled, transmitted a series of signals to the course comparator, and directional jets stuttered spasmodically as they forced the Stardust on a new tack.
Hardly had she come about when, against the rim of blackness beyond Saturn's disk, Roger saw the blue-white blasts of the comet's jets turning her also. He grinned confidently. It would take more than follow the leader tactics to beat the Stardust down. A sudden hubbub from beyond the engine room bulkhead brought him up tense. Along with Matthew's voice, shrill above the heavy step of the spaceman's boots on the engine deck catwalk, rose another and strange voice. The door was flung open. A slight, begrimed figure tumbled in after it. Matthews followed, his broad red face clouded with anger.
"Begging your pardon, sir. A bit of trash I found in the after-tank compartment."
His use of formal address, a bit of sheer showmanship for the benefit of the shivering stowaway, made Rogers smile inwardly.
"Shall I clap him in irons, sir?"
"Presently, Mr. Matthews." Rogers turned to the man, and at once felt something of Matthew's contempt. The fellow was no spaceman, certainly. A ragged beard, bleary eyes, spindly legs that trembled under every thrust of the ship's directional jets, stamped him as one of those human derelicts common to every port.
"No irons, mister, please. I didn't mean no harm," the man whined. "Just a bit of cop trouble, you know. Titan was getting too hot for me, so a friend, he tells me how to get away for a bit. I didn't mean no harm, honest, governor."
Oh, okay, so that's the accents we're doing. Thank you for telling me in the text. Let's try that again with more Cockney. I saw Governor and was like, oh, learned that a line or two too late.
"No irons, mister, please. I didn't mean no harm," the man whined. "Just a bit of cop trouble, you know. Titan was getting too hot for me, so a friend, he tells me how to get away for a bit. I didn't mean no harm, honest, governor."
You know the rule about stowaways? Asked Rogers. Irons in the brig are the toughest work aboard ship, port to port. Take your pick.
"Oh, I'll work, Captain. Anything you say, mister. I ain't afraid of work. It's drink did me in, nothing else."
The man's manner underwent a subtle change, now that his fate was settled.
"You wouldn't have just a wee drop about, would you, Admiral?"
Matthews clouted him on the back so that he almost fell on his face.
"Get below, you worthless scum!" roared the engine man, "and be thankful if we don't leave you to rot on Rhea. Drink indeed it is."
In the very act of getting to his feet, the stowaway froze, while the color seemed to drain out of his wizened face.
"Rhea? Heaven forbid we ain't going to Rhea!" he croaked.
And does your ticket say otherwise? Asked Matthews.
"Oh, and does your ticket say otherwise?" asked Matthews. "Did you maybe get on the wrong ship by mistake? Maybe it's a luxury liner to Terra you meant to board all along."
Impetus. Whoops. I just realized I muted myself by accident. My apologies.
"No!"
Yelped the man, plainly terrified.
"You ain't for Rhea. Not Rhea, mister. He never said you was for Rhea. Yapetus, he said. It ain't too late to head for Yapetus, is it?" "No, sir," snorted Matthews. "We'll change course immediately now you've ordered it. Get below."
Rogers lifted a hand. Hold a moment, Mr. Matthews. I'd like to know where this man got his misinformation. Surely every soul at Titan Port knows the Stardust and her run. Who told you Yapetus?
This friend, we call him Charlie, who told me how to ditch the cops," panted the man. "I ain't long on Titan. I'm from inside. He wasn't wrong, was he, Commodore? You're from Yapetus, sure."
Rhea, said Rogers. Course is set for her now. The stowaway's face went a trifle whiter under parchment yellow skin.
"He didn't tell me that. He lied, that dirty—"
What have you done? Snapped Rogers.
"I don't get you, Commodore."
What were you put on this ship to do? Talk fast. It'll soon be too late to alter course. The man wilted.
"You can't ground on Rhea, not for your life. You can't, governor. It's suicide, that's what."
Mr. Matthews, we'll have this man in irons after all.
Aye, grunted the engine man. And tend your engines. We've 12 hours to Rhea.
Aye, sir. Come along, you.
The man stood, terror-rooted.
It was only sugar, so help me. Just sugar like he told me. I even tasted it. Ain't no harm in sugar, is there?
Sugar?
The word came from Matthew's enormous as an oath.
You didn't.
He doped the tanks with it, of course,
said Rogers. Oh, whoops. He doped the tanks with it, of course, said Rogers. Didn't you? The man nodded dumbly. Best take him aft, Mr. Matthews, and find just what tanks were doped. Though I think we can guess. I'm sorry I'm mangling the voices on this. I should have probably read it first. That would have been good. With one enormous hand clamping the smaller man's shoulder like a vice, Matthews propelled him back into the engine compartment. Alone, Rogers listened to the muted click of the astrogator and found it a mockery. The Stardust, if she held course, was a doomed ship. 5 minutes later, the bulkhead door slid open again. If Matthews had been angry before, it was as nothing to the fury that now possessed him. He literally dragged the stowaway after him.
"'Twas the auxiliaries. Our takeoff jets will be that crusted she'll never lift off Rhea with 'em. Fool that I was, I noticed the throat pressure going up when we left Titan, and I never thought nothing of it."
You couldn't have helped it if you had, said Rogers. Get this man in irons and haul a tube inboard for inspection.
He never told me what it would do, groaned the stowaway. Said it would just slow you down so another ship could beat you to Iapetus. Not nothing about Rhea.
"Who was he?" growled Matthews. "You'll tell or I'll break your neck, you sniveling scum of a—"
He doesn't know, interrupted Rogers. Trust Ames to work through 3 or 4 agents. This man probably saw only the last of them. You remember he said he's new to Titan. It's a cold trail. Matthews strode off with his prisoner, the man still pleading that course be changed. While Saturn wheeled in the ebony heavens and the astrogator continued to click out its computations, Rogers bitterly Rogers bitterly reviewed the situation. What the report on the high-emission takeoff tubes would be, he was only too sure. These jets, burning special fuel with a high exhaust velocity, were vital at takeoffs and landings. Sugar in that fuel would have deposited inch-thick layers of stone-hard carbon in the refractory throat linings during the takeoff run from Titan. Such deposits cut the efficiency of the jets by 90%. Seizing pad and stylus, he made hasty calculations. They could land on Rhea by reversing the artificial gravity screen so as to reinforce the few jets the engine crew could scrape clear in the time remaining. To use the clogged tubes was to risk an explosion that would split the ship open from bow to stern. A landing with 20 clear jets and the screens was feasible, but deadly. The landing blasts could foul the cleared tubes anew, and in the 6 hours men could endure on Rhea, they could clean no more than 10 or 12 jets at most. Far too few to lift the ship again. They would be marooned 12 hours or more on Rhea, where 7 meant death. It was checkmate, and Ames had won. One look at Matthew's face when the engine man returned was enough to confirm all forebodings.
"Clogged to the gills," he growled. "There's 40 hours' work ahead of us to clean the lot, but the crew's started and we can land on 20 tubes with the screens helping."
He's got us, said Rogers bitterly. It's what he planned, all foolproof from his end. If he grounds first, we've no call to land at all and can be expected to put back for Titan. Even if we complain of sabotage there, he can afford to laugh it off. All we'll have to offer in evidence is our word. We'll have to clean the tubes again before landing. The fellow you caught can't testify against Ames because he doesn't know him. Matthew shook his grizzled head.
You ain't much on logic, son, and you make it sound tough. Only thing for us, as I see it, is to make ground fall ahead of Ames and beat him to the beacon and the Bismillah.
I'm afraid it's not that simple.
Afraid? What kind of talk is that, son? Where's your fighting spirit? We've got to. Them Marines don't know a good ship from a bad one. Those your dad first traded with aren't alive now, and the critters just swap like they've been taught. One time, when the Stardust was docked for repairs, your dad chartered an old scow. The Rians loaded it and took off their trade goods happy as you please. They'll trade with Ames as easy. We've got to get down first. Fella who wins the beacon contract gets the cargo too, and we can do it.
Maybe, said Rogers soberly, but we'll never leave Rhea alive if we do. We can land on 20 tubes and the screens in a pinch, but we can't take off on the few your crew can clean while we're grounded.
We'll have 6 hours,
Matthews pointed out gruffly.
I'll have 12 tubes ready for you by then. 13, maybe.
It's not enough. Even with the gravities and the cruising jets helping, we'd need at least 20 tubes to lift. Here are the figures.
Figures? Pah! Spat Matthews. We don't run ships by the book out here, son. It's by blood and sweat, by the last drop of sky juice and the last microvolt in our capacitors and the last thump of our engines. That's how your dad did it, and that's how I navigate. We just have to try, don't we? Didn't you just tell me what happens if we turn back to Titan like licked pups?
And what happens if we beat Ames to the beacon? Asked Rogers. He'll turn back to Titan without grounding, of course. Why should he, when we've won? Back in port, he'll pretend to be a good loser. And be surprised, in a sportsmanlike way, when we never reach Titan again. After that, he'll naturally take over the run anyway. We've got to face the fact that, once we make Rhea, we've a dead ship. At that, Matthews swore, roundly and vividly.
The Stardust's no dead ship and never will be so long as I've a pint in her tanks. Sure, and what do you plan to do if not lick Ames?
Rogers hesitated, a slow flush creeping up his cheeks. The first thing any master's supposed to do, restore his ship to spaceworthy condition. Ugh, my tongue! Why do you betray me now? The engine man smacked the chart table with his palm so that the instruments shook in their racks.
You can't do that, son. 'Tis a time to take a risk. Once Ames lands, he gets cargo. Won't be another batch of cargo for at least 50 hours after that, because your dad learned it takes the critters that long to collect and cure the stuff. If you land an hour after Ames, you'll take off empty-handed. No contract and no Bismillah, and the Stardust lost to you when we get back.
The old man paused to look at Rogers shrewdly.
Course, maybe you're figuring on landing 60, 70 hours after Ames. Maybe the Rians would have cargo, and maybe not. We don't know how soon they start. We don't know how soon they start collecting new batch after a trade visit. All we know is they've got a new batch every trip. Always have had, at least. You might get cargo that way now and then, but it wouldn't do you no good. Supposing even if we're lucky enough to get half the Bismillah while Ames gets the other half, a cargo every other trip maybe, then what? Why, the engine man continued, Ames would have the beacon contract, and that's 80% of his expenses. He'd only need to make 20% on the Bismillah to break even. All you'd have would be the same amount of Bismillah, if you're lucky, to pay all your expenses.
Hold on now. A full cargo of Bismillah is enough to pay a profit on any trip, even without the contract, interposed Rogers.
Won't be with Ames in the picture, grunted the engine man. Bismillah's a luxury trade right enough. A radioactive rare earth that's used in a lot of fancy beauty creams ought to fetch a fancy price.
Radioactive beauty creams? Come on, why? Sorry.
But Ames will undersell you as long as he has to, and the beacon contract will let him do it easy. He'll break you, son. That's why it's all or nothing.
Rogers stared thoughtfully before him. A new clicking of the astrogator broke in on his reverie.
He stepped to the machine and fingered its keys. The Stardust responded with a new kick of directional tubes.
Now you're blasting it all, Jet, son, said Matthews with a grin. Set her down and let the old girl get you off when the time comes. She always has.
Not this time, said Rogers quietly. I've altered course. Under his space tan, the blood seemed to recede from Matthew's face. His breathing was suddenly loud in the tiny navigation cubby, and his broad figure seemed to take on a stoop. He strode to the bulkhead door, but even as he touched it, he turned.
It ain't what your dad would have done, but maybe you're different. Guess you play things the safe way, like Ames figured you would.
The other flushed. Master's regulations forbid endangering crew or ship by landing on Rhea unless all takeoff tubes are in order. Deliberately, the engine man spat on the deck.
Pfft! Think we're a blasted bunch of passengers? We'd have took our chances, with any skipper willing to take his.
He swung back to the door. Mr. Matthews. The engine man looked back, scowling. Regulations also require that inoperative tubes be repaired at once against possible emergencies. You'll keep your men at that detail.
Aye, but I never dreamed Ben Rogers' son would turn out to be a rule book polisher, said Matthews bitterly. Shows how wrong a man can be.
He surveyed Rogers critically.
Or maybe I've been even wronger. Blood don't always tell. It takes guts to pilot the Rhea run, to ground trip after trip on a moon where you're good as dead after 6 hours. Maybe you never had that kind of guts. Maybe, Ames or no Ames, jets or no jets, you never would have set keel on Rhea anyway, because you ain't got what it takes.
He slammed the bulkhead door behind him so that the clang of it echoed funereally through the now silent ship. Following the end of the second Oiler's story, the hiss of the Medusa's circulation system resumed its omnipresent sway. The Oiler himself seemed lost in contemplation of the lumen tubes.
Yeah, you gotta feel sorry for the kid, the sub-third said all of a sudden. So he was yellow, maybe, but with the cards stacked that way, who wouldn't be?
It takes more'n guts to go back and take your licking sometimes, put in an engine hand, than to toss in your chips for keeps. The first Oiler spat accurately into the refuse well.
Yellow he was for my money.
He eyed the second Oiler speculatively. It was the sub-third who saw how things stood and tried to smooth them.
You talk too much, Jennings. So that's your opinion, and ours is ours. Don't forget the kid would have been risking every man aboard, not just his own neck. Take your heroes. I'll stick to a skipper who gets me back alive to spend my port money.
The engine man was bound to hear the whole story.
It couldn't have been that Ames had bit off. It couldn't have been that Ames had a bit of trouble and never got off Rhea himself after all.
No, said the second Oiler curtly, and made a long business of lighting his pipe again. He grounded nice as you please, while the Stardust swung around 10 hours off, and put his signal on the beacon and changed the batteries. The Rheans had been without salt and sodium a time, and the Bismillah was waiting, a full cargo. When he took off and passed the Stardust, she was still drifting idle while her engine crew scraped jets. What could you expect? But I wouldn't call Rogers yellow at all. A gleam of understanding grew in the first Oiler's gray eyes.
You know an almighty lot about this Rogers, he said softly, almost as if you'd been aboard the Stardust that trip.
The sub-third caught his eye, but the Oiler wouldn't stop.
Almost as if, it seems. Maybe you were. Sure you were. You're Rogers, ain't you?
The sub-third got up and placed himself between the two men.
Course not. What's got into you, Hodges? Better forget the whole thing. Time we turned in.
Oh, oh. Oh. Oh, wow. Okay. So that's fascinating. This just got awesome. So, it also means I've been doing the character's voice all wrong, but I knew that as soon as this started. Um,
Sit down, Peters, urged the second oiler. Nobody's calling me yellow.
Now hold on, urged the sub-third. Just a mistake, that's all. I just didn't mean nothing.
No matter if it no matter if he did, grunted the second. I'm not Rogers. I'm Ames.
so sorry about the voice change. We've had to do it twice now. General silence followed this announcement, its essence finally voiced by the engine hand.
Now you ain't making sense, mister.
The second oiler swore softly. Oh, wait, no. The engine hand is.
Now you ain't making sense, mister.
The second oiler swore softly.
Ain't I? You ought to read the articles you signed. Who's chairman of the fleet that owns this ship and 20 more? Not anybody called Ames. James Rogers. Bismullah's a dead trade now, but it laid the keels of half this fleet.
That don't make sense either. Ames got the beacon contract and the Bismillah, and now he's second oiler on a Rogers ship.
The sub-third shook his head.
Tain't reasonable.
Serve me right, said Ames. I was young and tough and played it dirty. Got what was coming to me.
He sucked hugely on the pipe and grinned.
Often think I was a fool not to see Rogers' game. Then I tell the whole yarn to somebody else, and when they don't see it either, I feel better.
But you did get the contract and the Bismillah.
First trip, sure, nodded Ames. But that was the last time. I never got another cargo, just made one trip after another servicing that blasted beacon. Like having a tiger by the tail, that was. I couldn't let go because the government contract called for big cash penalties if I was a day late any trip. Couldn't change my schedule. Couldn't call off the contract without losing my shirt. Couldn't get another ship because my credit dropped as soon as I started coming back to port with empty holds. I lost just enough each trip, over and above the 80% of the expenses the contract paid, to get in the red deeper and deeper. Rogers wrapped my own schedule around my neck and strung me up by it.
The sub-third suddenly swore, like a man tormented beyond endurance.
What in the name of 17 blasted space devils did he do? He roared.
Ames took a deep draw, enjoying the moment.
He wasn't yellow lying off Rhea like that. Just smart. He cleaned all the tubes so he'd be able to take off without any risk. Then he landed on Rhea, exactly 230 hours after I had. I was still 5 hours out from Rhea on my second trip then, never dreaming what he was up to. He landed nice as you please, swapped his cargo for all the Bismillah the Rheans had worked up since I'd been there, and took off. Wasn't a scrap of Bismillah for me when I landed a couple of hours later. The Rheans just looked kind of funny at us and crawled off. All we could do was service the beacon. Then we couldn't ground on Rhea again for 230 hours, and anyway, the contract called for us to come 240 hours later. Rogers made his second landing 230 hours later and loaded Bismillah again. We came and serviced the beacon.
Mean to say you never got cargo after that?
Asked the sub-third.
Not once. That was the story from then on. I serviced the beacon, lost 20% of my expenses each trip, and Rogers got the Bismillah. The government wouldn't touch him. Said the Bismillah was none of their business and they couldn't interfere with free trade. They wouldn't let me change schedule. Told me to work it out with Rogers. Finally, I wouldn't offered him the contract for free. He wouldn't take it without my comet.
Ames frowned at his pipe.
Still burns me up. He gave me a fair price, and I might still have a small ship if I hadn't run into bad luck in a hot spot on Luna. All's fair, as I'll admit, and I'd have done just what he did. But it burns me up all the same. Because why, of all the jobs he could have found for her, did he have to put my comet on the Iapetus run? Hauling fertilizer!
And that was, I can't even remember the name of it. Shoot. Schedule. And that was Schedule by Harry Walton. Uh, that was cute. I liked that. That was neat. Just kind of outsmarting somebody who just tried to cheat you by being like, hey, well, all right, you win this round, but oh, by the way, I'm going to screw you out of every single one of the trips you do for the next ever. And eventually, I'll make more of a profit than you do. So Rogers knew the math and was like, okay, there's a turnaround time on Bismillah. If we snag it right before this other guy gets it, he can't get any. And since apparently there's no trade laws in place to prevent such behavior, he'll keep doing it because it's free trade. Borderline piracy, maybe, but hey, it worked for him. So yeah, thanks for tuning in. Hope you dug it. Um, and next week I'll either do Helicopter Story or I will do this next story in this Astounding Science Fiction of from June of 1945 called Three Blind Mice, whatever it's about. There were three kinds of telepathic baldies in the world: the sane, well adjusted, the completely insane ones, mutants spoiled in the making, and the paranoids. And those last were deadly. So maybe we'll do that. Alrighty, thanks for tuning in. As ever, I do this every week at about noon Eastern Standard Time on Fridays, hence the Free Read Fridays. If that ever changes, everybody will know. I'll make it clear. Otherwise, you can be checking these out on YouTube. You can get that in the stream description. You're probably on YouTube listening to this now if you're listening to it at all. And yeah, you can check out my back catalog on YouTube. These are all, again, done live, so I'm not like doing fancy editing. I'm just reading the stories here. I would be doing it for a live audience if anybody ever tuned in live, which they tend not to. But you get the end result. So these are not studio edited. They are not studio quality. I'm just using a kind of a crappy headset and talking accordingly. Hopefully it does something for people. If it's not, I'm sorry. Tell me otherwise. I don't get nearly enough feedback. So feedback is always good. Give me feedback. But yeah, thanks for tuning in. I do other streams throughout the week. A Mecha Mondays stream where I do something giant robot related or mecha adjacent. Um, and then Warframe Wednesdays where I play some Warframe for a couple hours. All at noon Eastern Standard Time when possible. Alrighty, thanks again. Have a good one. Stay safe, stay sane, stay good, stay cool if it's hot where you are. It's hot where I am. Stay warm if it's cold where you are. Do what you need to do to survive. Try not to hurt other people though. Alrighty, have a good time and see you next time.